At long last, the national nightmare is over. Winnipeg's losing streak of 4 whole games is ended.
You're Locked On the Hockey Jets, your daily podcast on the Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey friends, and welcome to tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Harrison Lee, an avid Winnipeg Jets fan and an online blogger. You can follow me on Twitter at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. Thanks for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. If you like what you're hearing, be sure to like, follow, and subscribe on all of your favorite podcasting platforms and YouTube. Doing so, of course, is always free of charge and ensures you never miss another episode. Most of all, though, we just love and appreciate your support. Tonight's episode, obviously, we are talking about the Jets finally ending their 4-game losing skid. Can't really say that it was a particularly long losing streak, but I'm sure for the Jets and for the fan base, it felt like forever because, the losing streak was preceded by a not great record, right? And Winnipeg is now, 4-6 in their last 10, so a bit of a topsy-turvy last couple of weeks. And I think for Winnipeg, it's been a tough road on the road, so to speak. Not many breaks at home, which is a little bit frustrating. But you know what? The most important thing is the national nightmare is over. The Jets have won a game against the Buffalo Sabres. Maybe it's time for things to start naturally realigning and for the Jets to get things back on track. We'll talk about how the Jets pulled off this win against a struggling but still frustrating opponent in just a little bit. But before we go any further, just thought I'd let you know that tonight's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. New customers can place a $5 bet, and you'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. Now, like I said, Winnipeg versus Buffalo, weird game, right? I think I kind of came into this game expecting the Jets to have a really big bounce-back performance after a rough couple of weeks, and the Jets kind of did. I would say for about maybe half to 2/3 of the game, the Jets were at least even with Buffalo, or at times even better. For a good stretch of the second period, I would say like the midway to back half of the second, the Jets were really in control of this game. I thought that there was a lot of offensive pressure. Winnipeg looked fast and responsive, and I saw good stuff in Winnipeg's chance creation. It wasn't until the third period where things kind of started to slide a bit back in Buffalo's favor. And quite honestly, the Jets were a little bit fortunate that the Sabres didn't convert on a couple of really dangerous chances. I think the big story of the Jets recently is in some of these closer games, they have really noticeable defensive breakdowns, but not every night are they getting punished for them. Hellebuyck has bailed them out. Maybe some really timely blocks from the defenders have covered the rest. But I think the Jets probably aren't super thrilled with how some of these games are going. The shooting percentage is a bit down, and the defensive breakdowns are putting the goaltending under a lot of stress. So Winnipeg will want to clean that up. But, I think the most important thing is that you get yourself back in the win column, you end the losing streak, and you get a little bit of confidence back. And I think, for a game in which the Jets' top line was decent, they scored a couple of goals, both that even strengthened on the power play. And there were some, perhaps favorable reviews for the Jets in this one. However you got to the win, I think it was just good to get a little bit of the vibes back. Now, beating the Sabres isn't exactly the most impressive feat, but I'm not really looking for impressive stuff right now. I just want the Jets to get back to brass tacks, go for, some good stuff. Give me quality play. I don't have to see a masterpiece, but if you can at least outplay your opponent, even with all the injuries and fatigue, I think that would be, a really welcome sign. And I think for decent stretches of this game, the Jets did that. For the defensive frailties, obviously Pierre-luc and Fleury and Heinola at times, plus Stanley. It was a little bit of a rough mixture, I won't lie, but the Jets still pulled through. And I think, without Samberg, Winnipeg is doing its best. It's definitely a little bit frustrating with how they've maybe done some of these defensive pairings. I really feel like Coughlin and Miller should honestly be playing more. I thought that they've both been good. Miller has had a little bit of an up and down past couple of weeks, but in some of his recent games, I thought he's generally been very reliable. And Coughlin, in his one game against the Knights, looked immediately like one of our best right-handed defenders. And I don't really want to rely on that because it is just a one-game sample. But, it is noticeable that he made really good reads and pinches, and I thought his passing and puck movement were good enough to where he looked like an NHLer, right? And if that's all that he is, that's fine. Like a guy who can slide in on your third pairing occasionally, give you some games. I don't think anyone hates that. And so I was a little surprised that, not either one of these guys were in. Winnipeg is definitely trying to make the Ville Heinola and Logan Stanley pairing work, which, yeah, I'm not sure I like that plan so much. I get the theory of trying to pit the rookies alongside each other, competing for one of these final third pairing spots, but I just feel like when they're together, it's a bit of a rough show. Heinola tries to do too much. Stanley tries to work himself out of trouble, and it's just not a good mixture for a stable blue line pairing. I know that the Jets are trying to assess what they have in both guys post-injury and into their recovery periods, but it's just not really, to me, it doesn't really feel like a great gamble. We already kind of know what Stanley is, and I think if you get him, if you get Heinola away from Stanley, it's a very different experience. Stanley, or Heinola and Miller, I thought was actually a pretty good pairing. The puck movement was a lot cleaner. The zone exits were generally more controlled. When Heinola is with Stanley, you can kind of tell what his mindset is, and it's trying to create plays and be aggressive because I think in some ways, whether it's implicit or explicit, Heinola is indicating he doesn't really want to give the puck back to Logan all that much. And when you see what happens with Stanley behind the net, it's not exactly surprising. I don't think Logan is the most trustworthy, pairing mate when it comes to handling passes cleanly and getting ready for breakouts. So, I think it's a tough thing. If you're going to play Stanley, I would probably prefer to have him alongside a Miller or something. I think, a more veteran defender who's a little less, green and maybe has more experience handling pressure and knowing when to be the one to be assertive on the puck might be the better play. But, the perfect play is just to not have Stanley in. But again, I get what the Jets are doing. I know that, every team has at least one or two defenders where they really, stick by them, even if the puck movement isn't great, even if the zone exits aren't controlled. And I get it, right? You have your guy, you like him, it is what it is. But I think for the Jets, especially when you're dealing with as many injuries as the Jets have, I think you don't have a margin of error where you can keep playing these guys, especially in a starting lineup. So I think the Jets have some difficult decisions to make, but hopefully they come to a good decision over the next couple of weeks. Again, where the Jets are in the standings, they're, second in the division, tied with Minnesota in points. And, they've got a 19-8 record, so they're sitting pretty. I think they're feeling pretty okay despite the recent streak. Obviously, I'm sure there's at least a modicum of frustration there, but the Jets are still in a really good spot, right? 704 winning percentage or points percentage, and I think you can feel pretty good about that. You gave yourself enough of a margin and a cushion for in case anything happens like this. And that's where, having that early start that the Jets were just raking in points sets you up for when you maybe have a little bit of a stumble like Winnipeg has recently. So overall, I think this win was competent. I don't think it was anything crazy. The Jets also created some really good chances that Luukkonen was able to save. And so, it was a tense, fraught affair. The one thing I think that's probably worth spotlighting and maybe talking about over the next couple of weeks is what's going on with the Lowry line. I feel like the defensive awareness and, the slot play has been really rough. That trio just seemingly is wearing down, and I think the Jets might need to figure out a plan because it can't be, the Lowry line trying to win every single matchup and your two skill lines picking up the pieces, right? I don't think having Lowry be your leadoff batter is really helpful in the long run. It's just asking too much of these guys. And while they've been able to perform really well under a lot of very difficult circumstances, especially with this road trip, it just seems like they're being run ragged. So it'd be nice if the top lines can start giving a little more. The top line was, pretty noticeable in this game. I think all of Scheifele, Velarde, and Connor put in a pretty good shift, and so that was very positive to see. I just want them to keep doing that. My criticism of this line has been that it's very inconsistent, right? You have good games, and then you have like 3 or 4 games where they just can't seem to create anything, and it puts too much stress on everyone else. So let's hope that over the next couple of days, they keep putting up good performances. If the Jets are going to keep playing them, then at least they just need to be good. So we'll keep an eye on that. Winnipeg is trying to make the best of some moldy apples right now. And, speaking of that, the Jets have called up some kids. They're bringing in youth. And you're probably wondering what the overall assessment for guys like Brad Lambert and Ville Heinola is. I will say it's been a bit of a mixed bag, but we'll chat about why in just a brief moment. Before we go too much further, though, just wanted to let you know about our friends and partners at FanDuel. Get ready to tackle the NFL action with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if you win. The FanDuel Sportsbook app gives you everything you need to place live bets on the NFL all in one place. If you're watching, some of the games this weekend, the Ravens for me are on a bye, so I'm not going to be watching, but a lot of you are probably following the Vikes, or maybe you're a Commanders fan. I don't even know who's on a bye this weekend, so some of you might be in a bit of a holding pattern. But if you're getting a hunch in one of these other games, maybe a marquee matchup this weekend, make sure you check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more, all on the same page where you're placing your bets. That's all at FanDuel.com. And again, you'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. That's only at FanDuel.com. Never waste a hunch and make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. Hey friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Everydayers, thank you so much for rejoining us on tonight's episode as we are chatting about the recent stuff with Winnipeg having to play younger players in the lineup and maybe asking a bit more of some of your, not only your rookies, but maybe your under 23 defenders. Really, it's just one particular player that I'm talking about here, and that's Ville Heinola, and on the rookie side, Brad Lambert. And, under the current circumstances, I don't think the Jets were really intending to ask either of these guys to play the specific roles that they are right now. Heinola, I think, had a more inside track on the third pairing, but with Lambert, I don't really think that expectation existed. Yeah, based on preseason, I think the Jets pretty clearly intended Lambert to mainly play with the Moose this year, and I don't disagree with that assessment. I think Brad looked like he had flashes in camp, but there wasn't a lot of consistency to his game to where I felt that he was ready for NHL duty. And, the recent couple of games that he's played, I'm still in that camp, right? At 2C between Perfetti and Nemesnikov, it's been okay, right? You see flashes where Lambert will pull off some nice passes. There are some good scoring chances with this line, and there's definitely speed, but I'm not really seeing the full cohesive game with Brad, and it's not necessarily an effort thing. He'll back check pretty aggressively. He'll force turnovers. He does some pretty noticeable defensive work, but just in terms of his overall game and his ability to create time and space at the NHL level, it's still kind of work in progress, right? He's not exactly the most physically robust player in the corners, and I think in some ways it's kind of noticeable. Nemesnikov, I think, has done a good job of trying to eat up some of, more of that forechecking, but, it's not like Lambert's losing battles all the time, but I just think you notice he's not the biggest center. And I think it's a really interesting question going forward where he actually plays. At lower levels, his best position has been at center. But if you're playing at the NHL level, maybe it ends up being out wide. And I'm not going to write off the 2C role, long term, but I just feel like as of right now, Brad probably makes more sense as a winger than as, a guy down the middle. I just don't think that his game is well-rounded enough yet. And I think at the NHL level, where the timing and spacing is a lot more limited, eventually Brad will put 2 and 2 together, and I think he'll be a really good forward. But I just don't know if it's going to be in that center role. If he moves to maybe as a winger and kind of provides that Ehlers impact, maybe that's where his best play will be at the senior level. But again, it's still pretty early days. I think for the first few games with the Jets this year, it's been, it's been okay. I wouldn't say that I've been, blown away. I also don't really think I was expecting a lot either. With Lambert, I'm just looking to see if he can keep up. I'm not really asking him to be a huge creator. I don't think that my expectation was for him to hit the ground running and really excel. With the Moose not exactly lighting things on fire, I didn't really have a great sense of what his participation offensively was. But watching him with the Jets, it's clear that in terms of the NHL stuff, there's still work to be done, and that's not super shocking. I still think that he can be an effective player for this team at some point this year. I don't think it can be in this prime top six role. And a lot of people will say, well, the only place he should be is the top six, because if he goes to the bottom six, his skill is wasted. And I actually disagree with that. I think that there's a real chance that in maybe a third line, or even perhaps an expanded fourth line role, there's real value in the finishing and speed that he brings, even if it's in controlled bursts. Maybe playing alongside Kupari or something would be beneficial, right? You've got two speedsters. You've got Barron, who's pretty decent at forechecking, and Lambert's finishing and playmaking might actually play off the zone time that fourth line creates pretty well. The fourth line, generally speaking, is one of the few lines in their limited minutes that just tend to win their matchups. And it's not like they're playing particularly gruesome, grindy minutes. You're mostly asking them to spell the Lowry line and help out the top two lines every now and then. And maybe that wouldn't be the worst for Lambert to move to at some point. But I can also see an argument where if you're trying to build up his confidence and trying to see what he can really do, then, it's probably better to let him sink or swim in the top six. But I think right now I wouldn't say he's sinking, but he's also not really got the Olympic stride or Olympic stroke in either, right? It's just a modest level of play from him. But again, for a young rookie, first couple of NHL games in a not particularly great supportive environment, it's not been the worst, right? I think he's being asked to do a lot on a team that has recently been playing pretty bad hockey. And, Nemesnikov and Perfetti, I think Perfetti, I see some really good playmaking from him, but he's not exactly a speedster. Nemesnikov has tried to create good space and forechecking ability, but it's not like he's, the offensive dynamo that maybe you would expect to play a young gun like Lambert with. So it's making the most of a rough situation. And I think in that vein, Lambert's not been awful, but I just don't think, again, that it's quite time for him to take on this role. Heinola, I think that there's more to his game that suggests he's a little more ready for this duty. Right now, I don't think it's showing alongside Stanley, and it's not really shocking. Stanley is kind of challenging to play with. I think it sort of harkens back to what Scheifele maybe mentioned about playing with Ehlers, in that he's a little unpredictable. With Stanley, there's maybe some level of predictability, but it's maybe not for the right reasons. A lot of times he gets himself in trouble behind the net, or he doesn't close and gap quite effectively. He doesn't use his body size as effectively as he could. And I think, what was it, the Cousins goal or something the other night? That was really his read. Heinola tried to stop I forget who it was, maybe the left winger or something, or maybe it was a center. I think it was a left winger, actually, and Cousins just kind of cut in against Stanley towards the center slot. Stanley didn't really have the foot speed to get there, and I don't know if he just didn't realize Cousins was coming in, but very clearly he didn't get the interior positioning, and Cousins basically had a straight shot at net for a tip-in. So that's the kind of play where I feel like, Heinola maybe wanted to cut the cross-seam pass out a little cleaner, but didn't get that chance, and Stanley really couldn't help him out. And I just feel like that kind of stuff, it really should be a scenario where Heinola has a more stable partner to help him out. When Ville was playing with Miller, the puck movement was a lot crisper. The zone experts were faster. There was more, I guess, what you could call tiki-taka passing, quick one-touch passes, quick breakout and stretch passes. And I just felt like the puck movement out of the defensive zone was better. That doesn't mean that the Heinola-Miller pairing didn't have extended D-zone shifts, but it was less frequent than what we see with Stanley and Heinola. And again, I totally get why the Jets are trying to make this work, but I think that the truth is, Stanley is what he is. You're in your eighth or ninth year with him at this point. The odds of him turning into a top six decent defender are pretty slim. In fact, I would say they're non-existent at this point. Heinola still has some upside and some ability to improve his game, and I think we see that at times, especially as he grows more confident and feels like he can trust his partner. But right now, I don't think he really has either of those. And it's tough, right? You want to impress the coaching staff and you want to be noticeable, but when the standard is don't screw up and let the game come to you. It's a little hard for Heinola to do his thing when, Stanley's a little bit of a chaotic situation as a partner. So I think for Ville, he's also kind of been in the not so great camp, but there are signs that it's more due to the pairing than explicitly stuff that he's doing wrong. Are there moments where he maybe pinches a little bit too aggressively and I don't like it? Absolutely. But I think it's also understandable why he's trying to make plays happen and why he's trying to be, maybe a little bit preemptive ahead of something that might turn into a really bad defensive zone shift. Again, I don't think it's working out for him right now, but I understand why he's making those decisions. And so if you get Heinola on a pairing that's a little more stable, I think you could see a massive improvement already. Heinola and Miller is just a better pairing. And, Miller in general really shouldn't be being benched as often as he is the past couple of games. But I don't know. Winnipeg has made some very interesting decisions. Not sure I agree with them, but I guess I hope it works out for them. I would prefer that they maybe make some other decisions, but the Jets are the Jets, right? They will do what they're going to do. Now, for Winnipeg, this weekend is going to be a pretty difficult test. Obviously, this upcoming slate of back-to-backs is not easy, even though you're not exactly facing the craziest teams. First, you've got Chicago, and then you've got the Blue Jackets, and neither of these teams are quite as bad as you think. Or at least the Blue Jackets are in Columbus or Chicago, maybe a little bit of a different story, but we'll chat about that in just a brief moment and what I think will happen in each of these games. Hey friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for rejoining us on tonight's episode as we're checking in on a couple of games that the Jets are about to play this weekend. Going to be a tough slate, not because it's particularly difficult opponents, but partly because it's just a bit of a condensed schedule, right? Back-to-backs are always rough, and the Jets have to go from Chicago to Columbus, which in this case is actually among the shortest distances that they've had. And apologies, I said Chicago to Columbus. It's Chicago to Winnipeg. That's relatively convenient. If it was Chicago to Columbus, it'd be probably a pretty similar distance. Neither of these cities are particularly far from each other, at least compared to some of the road trip stuff the Jets have had to do recently. But between these two games, I think the Chicago one will be the easier matchup. And I say this with all respect to Chicago. I know that they're trying to make things happen, but you look at this lineup, and this really feels like an opportunity for the Jets to get another win, right? Bedard, Kurashev, and Teravainen as their first line is not bad. Bedard maybe starting to put 2 and 2 together after a rougher start. Teravainen still dangerous. Kurashev is where the matchup for the Jets really should favor Winnipeg, although with Scheifele not at 100%, maybe that doesn't quite do the math justice, especially with how good Teravainen and Bedard can be. Then you've got Hall, Donato, and Bertuzzi. Hall, I think, is probably a player of some interest to the Jets. I personally would not be after him for Winnipeg's, trade deadline stuff, but, sometimes they like these aging, veteran forwards. I would probably prefer that they go elsewhere for their scoring help. Third line, you've got Foligno, Dickinson, and Mikheyev. This is a fine third line. It's just fine. There's forechecking ability. There's some grit and sandpaper. And Mikheyev, I guess, is an okay finisher. But other than that, probably nothing to be too crazy about. And finally, you've got Maroon, Reichel, and Smith. Again, this team just has, a lot of bottom or middle six players being asked to do more than what they're typically capable of. And so, yeah, I mean, Chicago is not as bad as it was in previous years, but this is still a pretty bad team, right? This is not a squad that is expecting to do much, and they are last in the Central for a reason. So, should be a Jets win. I don't want to be unpleasantly surprised here in this game. I don't really imagine that the Jets drop this in any way, but if they do, I mean, yeah, probably not a great, a great feeling for the Jets if they can't pull this one off. But I feel really good about this one. I think this is going to be like a 4-2 or a 4-1 win. I feel pretty confident in that. Watch me be wrong, and it's just really stupid. But I think if the Jets lose this game, you might start having some real questions about what's going on with this team's performance. The second game, I think, is not quite as clear-cut of a straight win. it's Columbus, right? And the Jets will be taking Columbus on in Winnipeg. So, you could say it's home ice advantage, but having the second half of the back-to-back kind of, in my mind, at least nullifies a little bit of the advantage. Now, again, like I said, Chicago to Winnipeg is pretty short, and so it's not the biggest deal, but it's still a bit of a rough schedule here, especially coming off of a road trip that you've been quite active across North America. A lot of travel for the Jets, and it would be nice if they could at least just have more than a couple of games at a time in Winnipeg, which will happen later this month. It's just getting to that point. It's going to take some time, but Columbus has been winning more games than I think people are expecting. Van Riemsdyk, Monahan, and Johnson anchor your first line. Monahan has been, really impressive for them overall. And I think he's kind of showing why when the Jets traded for him, he was great in the regular season. It was just when the playoffs hit that Monahan's weaknesses were a little more apparent with the skating. But in terms of like regular season stuff, I think he's doing a great job. And, more than anything, it's you just root for him, right? Especially with losing one of his best friends in Johnny. It's just wonderful to see him doing so well for Columbus. He went to the Blue Jackets to be with Johnny, and while he can't do that maybe in person, it does feel like they're still playing together in spirit. And so it's just, you can't ever root against it, right? It's something that you want to see succeed. And in many ways, I hope that he's found some peace. It's hard. It's still fresh, and I know that he probably still thinks about it every day. I know having lost family recently, I still think about it all the time. But, all the same, Monahan seems to be doing really well for Columbus, and I just hope that it keeps on happening for him. He seems like a really nice guy. He's maybe a little introverted, or maybe doesn't come off as the strongest interview, but he seems like a legit good dude. So really hoping the best for him, and I'm always thinking of him and his family. On the second line, you've got Voronkov, Fantilli, and Marchenko. This is a sneaky, really good line. Maybe not so much for fans outside of Columbus who aren't as familiar with Marchenko and Voronkov. Marchenko is a monster on the forecheck and is a great scorer. Voronkov has generally had a pretty decent season coming, from overseas. But Fantilli, of course, one of their top young prospects, maybe in a class above Kent Johnson at some point. But Fantilli is still kind of finding his way at the NHL level. I think that the Marchenko name here is the one that I'm really circling. But Fantilli and Voronkov in support is very dangerous. Really shouldn't take it lightly. And I think this team is just surprisingly underrated in some ways. There's more to them than just being a rebuilder. And I think sure, they might not be high up in the standings in the center or in the Metro. They're towards the bottom, but given how competitive the Metro is and the fact that the difference between 4th and 7th is just 4 points, it's not quite as far apart as you might think. So again, this is a really creative line. Marchenko, one of their top players. Fantilli is having an all right second season, and Voronkov seems to be finding his way too. So yeah, don't want to sleep on that second line. And then the third line also has been doing really well. Aston Reese with Sillinger and Olivier, pretty good trio. Sillinger is a really underappreciated middle six center, great scorer. Aston Reese, journeyman, but still pretty good. He spent some time with the Penguins, of course. But overall, I just think that there's, a nice balance in this top nine. The fourth line, the Jets should have an advantage against Corrali, Danforth, and LeBlanc. Not exactly the fastest, but LeBlanc has been doing pretty well for Columbus. Nice finishing ability. Maybe could have used a little bit of that in the Jets if he'd been a higher speed skater. But otherwise, I think the Jets should be able to take advantage of the matchup. On defense, they've got Werenski and Fabro, of course, came basically for free, and he's been great for Columbus. I mean, he's found money, right? Fabro was good for the Predators, but they just, maybe didn't use him the right way. And alongside Werenski, it seems like he's just, he's like a perfect complementary piece for Werenski's offensive chops. Second pairing, Provorov and Severson, they've been doing fine. I don't really care too much about them for obvious reasons, but Severson's always one of those interesting defenders where it's hard to tell what he's good at, but he does score a lot. So I think whatever his deficiencies may be elsewhere, at least he's a points magnet. Third pairing, you've got Christensen and Harris. Harris, I think, is a nice bottom pairing guy, a player that I would not have minded the Jets going after at some point. Again, more for the depth side than anything, but for Winnipeg, I think they're probably hoping to shoot for a little more if they're going for a D. So interesting stuff, right? Columbus is one of those teams that, you really have a hard time rooting against. All that said, I do hope the Jets come away with a home victory. It'd be nice to sweep the weekend of games. 4 points would be great. 3 points would be fine, good even. Anything that you get out of these two games, whether it's 1 or 2 points, I think is just helpful. Would prefer at least 3, right? I think that there's a real chance for the Jets to do that, but if they get 2 points, I guess it's whatever. But again, this team, if the Jets are real serious, they should come away with 3 or more. So cross your fingers. Give me your score predictions. I think for the Blue Jackets game, I'm going to say 3-2 Jets. I think the margins of victory are going to be narrow, but maybe they surprise us and come away with something big. Let me know what you think the Jets are going to do in each of these games in the comments below, or at my social medias at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. For tonight's episode, though, that's going to be all the time that we have. Thank you so much for listening and making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. We'll have coverage of Winnipeg versus Chicago on tomorrow's episode, a recap of that. And then, of course, on Monday, Winnipeg versus Columbus. But for tonight's episode, that's all the time that we have. Thanks so much for listening and making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. We'll see you here tomorrow. So thanks for listening. Have a great night. And as always, go Jets go.